All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're gonna kind of jump into the whole Zelensky-Trump thing and kind of, with the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. There's some pretty intense stuff out there. Like we're looking at a YouTube video from Andrew Tate's Valuetainment channel, and they have some pretty strong opinions. They even go so far as to call Zelensky's Oval Office visit like a PR disaster. I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment? Was it really that bad?
Yeah, it's definitely a strong statement, right? I mean, calling it a PR disaster is pretty harsh. The video focuses on this one interaction between Zelensky and J.D. Vance. Vance was still a senator back then. And it gets a little tense when Vance brings up the whole conscription thing in Ukraine, kind of implying that maybe it's not all voluntary. And the video, it like zooms in on Zelensky's body language, arms crossed, leaning back. And they're saying it shows disrespect, that he's being defensive.
It's interesting, isn't it? They're really analyzing every little gesture. I mean, come on, body language can be so subjective. Maybe he was just trying to stay composed, under pressure. Like, he's being accused of some pretty serious stuff. It's amazing how people can watch the same footage and come away with completely different interpretations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you got to be careful about reading too much into body language. Plus, we have to think about the context, right?
Hmm.
Zelensky was in the U.S. trying to get support, with the whole Russia situation looming over everything. So, I mean, the guy was probably under immense pressure. Any little thing could have been blown out of proportion.
Oh, for sure. I mean, talk about a high-stakes situation. Like, every move he makes is being scrutinized, right? And the valuetainment video even brings up stories, like anecdotes, about men in Ukraine being, like, pulled off the streets and forced into military service, like, as if to prove their point that Zelensky was being defensive about the whole conscription issue. But do you think those stories really give us the whole picture?
Well, I mean, anecdotes are powerful, right? They get your attention, for sure. But I'm not so sure they always show the full picture. It's a war zone, right? Things are chaotic. And I mean, governments sometimes have to take drastic measures. I'm not saying what's happening is right or wrong, but I think we have to remember the context. I mean, it might not be some big cover-up. It could just be the reality of war.
That's a good point. It's like, there's always more to the story. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. But speaking of seeing things differently, the valuetainment video goes on to talk about Trump praising Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, which is weird because Starmer was a big critic of Trump, right? So, what do you think is going on there? Why this sudden praise?
Well, that's where the video really gets into its main argument, I think,
Yeah.
about how Trump, how he works on the world stage. They're basically saying that Starmer probably, agreed to what Trump wanted in private, and that's why he got the praise, even though publicly he was critical. They're using this example to say that Trump does this a lot, especially with European leaders.
So it's like a carrot and stick kind of thing. You play ball, you get rewarded, you don't. Well, but I mean, isn't that a bit of a simplification? International diplomacy, isn't it way more complicated than that?
Oh, absolutely. It's way more complex. To say that it all comes down to personal dynamics,
Yeah.
that's definitely an oversimplification. There's a lot more going on, like economic interests, historical alliances, and, internal politics within each country.
Totally. I mean, it's like, saying the only thing that matters in a symphony is the violins. You're missing the whole orchestra. And the video doesn't stop there. They go on to talk about European leaders, like making these huge generalizations, especially when comparing them to Trump. They're saying that European leaders are like run by femininity and that they lack this masculine imperative, like they're not strong enough or something.
Yeah, that's where things get a little controversial, I guess. They're really pushing this idea that Trump's way is, strong and effective, and that the European leaders are just weak and easily manipulated.
And they're tying this whole thing about the masculine imperative to success in international relations, which is just, I don't know, it feels like they have a very specific agenda, wouldn't you say? Like they're trying to push a certain viewpoint.
Yeah, and it's a really loaded term, right? Masculine imperative. What does that even mean? Are they saying that being aggressive and dominant is like the only way to succeed in international relations?
And does that even work in the real world? I mean, haven't we seen like plenty of strong and effective women leaders throughout history? It feels like they're painting this black and white picture of global politics, and the real world just isn't that simple.
Yeah, they are definitely trying to fit things into a very specific narrative. But even if we like entertain their framework for a second, it does bring up some interesting questions about Zelensky, right? Yeah. Because they're claiming that European leaders, even if they seem feminine, they end up doing what Trump wants anyway.
Okay, so I'm seeing where you're going with this. So if Zelensky's seen as defiant and chooses to align himself with European leaders. What does that mean for him in the long run, especially if this whole masculine imperative thing is really how the world works, according to the video? I mean, is he putting himself in danger?
Yeah, that's a question we definitely need to unpack. So,
Yeah.
yeah, this whole masculine imperative idea, what do you make of it? I mean, the video uses it to explain like everything from Trump's trade deals to, his relationships with other world leaders. Like they even bring up this thing with Trump putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico,
Yeah.
saying that's, an example of his masculine imperative and that both countries just caved in right away and did what he wanted. Is that a valid way to look at international relations?
Honestly, I don't know. It's hard to swallow. It just feels so like basic,
Mhm.
and kind of old fashioned, to be honest. Like the idea that world politics is just this big alpha male contest is just, I don't know. It seems like they're missing a lot of the details.
Right. And like boiling down entire countries and their political systems to these like gender stereotypes. I mean, it's not just inaccurate, it's kind of dangerous, don't you think?
Right.
Like you're ignoring all the economic stuff, the historical alliances, the political pressures within those countries.
Yeah, totally. It's like saying all romantic comedies are the same just because they have, love and laughter. You're missing all the unique characters, the plot twists, the emotional depth. Each country has its own story, its own reasons for doing things, its own internal struggles. To just lump them all together under masculine or feminine, it's just lazy. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, think about it. There are so many examples of countries with totally different political systems and leadership styles working together. It's not about who's the toughest guy in the room. It's about, finding solutions that work for everyone.
Right. So we've kind of established that this masculine imperative framework, it's shaky at best. But, okay, let's say, for argument's sake, we play along with it. Where does Zelensky fit into all of this? I mean, the video seems to be saying that because he didn't play along with Trump, he's putting himself and Ukraine in danger.
That's where the video gets really dark, I think. They're saying that only America could keep Zelensky safe after the war. And that, because he kind of stood up to Trump, he's made himself vulnerable.
But isn't that a bit much? Like, assuming that Zelensky's safety depends entirely on one American leader, it seems a little, I don't know, short-sighted. What about the support from other countries, international organizations?
Totally. It's a very America-focused viewpoint. They're downplaying all the support from, the European Union, for example, who've been backing Ukraine the whole time.
Hmm.
And they're ignoring the fact that Zelensky has earned a ton of respect globally for his, bravery and leadership.
He's become like a symbol of standing up to bullies, right? To say that he's screwed unless he keeps one American leader happy, it just doesn't make sense. He's got support from all over the world.
And you got to remember, Ukraine's its own country, right, with its own goals. Zelensky's main job is to look out for Ukraine, not to please any particular foreign leader.
It's like saying a painter should only use certain colors because some rich guy who likes their work prefers those colors. In the end, it's the artist's vision that matters, right?
Wow.
Same with a leader. Their decisions should be based on what's good for their country, not on keeping some foreign power happy.
That's a great analogy. And it really shows how complicated Zelensky's position is. He's got to balance, the needs of his country with all the pressures of international diplomacy. It's not easy.
It's like walking a tightrope during an earthquake or something. And saying he's only going to survive if he fits into this masculine box, it's just not fair, and it's oversimplifying things.
Yeah, definitely. We should judge leaders based on what they do, their actions, their commitment to their people, not on whether they fit into some outdated gender stereotype.
So where does that leave Zelensky then? If we throw out this whole masculine imperative idea, how do we understand what he's doing with Trump and, relying on European leaders?
That's a good question. I think we've got to look past these simple categories and, really get into the specifics of what these leaders are doing and why. For example, the valuetainment video brings up the Canadian Prime Minister, right? They're saying that even though he criticized Trump publicly, he ended up doing what Trump wanted anyway.
Like saying, talk is cheap, you better do what I say. But isn't there a difference between cooperating, strategically and just blindly obeying? I mean, you can work with someone you don't agree with without, selling out your own values, right?
Exactly. Diplomacy is about finding common ground, sure, but it shouldn't mean giving up your country's independence or, your integrity as a leader.
So instead of worrying about whether Zelensky is masculine enough, maybe we should be asking different questions. Like, what's he actually doing to help Ukraine? What compromises is he willing to make? And what are his absolute no-go zones?
Exactly. Let's look at the real actions, not just these labels. That's where we'll find the real story.
Agreed. But before we get into all that, there's another thing the valuetainment video throws out there. They say Zelensky might be a cocaine addict and that this could be affecting his behavior. They do say there's no real proof, but still.
That's a pretty serious accusation to make without any evidence.
It feels like they're trying to discredit him by, resorting to gossip and personal attacks.
It's a cheap shot, for sure. And it makes you wonder about, how objective the video really is.
It's a good reminder to be careful about what we believe, especially online where people have their own agendas.
Absolutely. We got to be critical thinkers, especially now with all the misinformation out there.
Okay, so we've tackled this whole masculine imperative thing, and we've talked about some of the more questionable claims in the video. What's next? How do we get past these simplistic stories and really understand what Zelensky's doing and how international relations actually work?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it starts with understanding that there are many different perspectives, and they all have their own biases.
It's like looking at a sculpture from different angles. Each view gives you something different, but none of them show you the whole thing.
And to really appreciate it, you have to see all the angles and how they work together.
I like that. So let's zoom out and try to see Zelensky's actions in a wider context.
Yeah, let's do that. And let's think about the historical and political background, too. The bigger picture that's influencing everything.
Sounds good. So let's jump in and explore the complexities of Zelensky's leadership and all the challenges he's facing on the world stage.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we're back and ready to really dig into Zelensky's actions on the world stage. We got to move past these labels and try to understand how complicated his position really is.
Sure. I mean, you think about it. Zelensky came into power with a ton of problems already, right? Like a bad economy, that whole conflict in eastern Ukraine and all the corruption he was trying to clean up. Then, boom, Russia invades. His whole world changes in an instant.
It's crazy, right? I mean, suddenly he's not just dealing with internal problems, he's leading a country in a war for its survival. How do you even process that?
It's pretty remarkable how he's adapted. He went from reformer to wartime leader overnight. And he's did a pretty good job. I mean, getting international support, keeping people's spirits up back home. He's become like this global symbol of resistance, standing up to a bully.
It's impressive how he's managed to get the world's attention, right? And all the support from so many different countries. It kind of goes against what the valuetainment video was saying, about Zelensky being isolated and only having Europe, which they don't seem to trust.
Right. I mean, look at the amount of help Ukraine has received,
Mm-hmm.
right? Military aid, financial help, humanitarian stuff, diplomatic backing. It's not just about keeping Trump happy or clinging to Europe. This is about a whole bunch of countries recognizing that Russia is a threat and standing with Ukraine.
It shows you how good Zelensky is at diplomacy, right? He's able to connect with people. It's not just about politics and deals. It's about a leader fighting for his people.
Yeah.
And people respond to that genuineness.
That's so important, his communication style. He's using social media to speak directly to people all over the world, sharing those heartfelt messages, showing the real cost of war.
Yeah, those videos from Kiev, the speeches to different parliaments, it's made it real for people. It's not just about geopolitics anymore. It's about real people fighting for their homes, their families.
Exactly. He's made this into a fight for democracy, for freedom, for the values that the whole world order is based on.
So how do we square that with what the valuetainment video is saying? They're pushing this idea that Zelensky messed up big time by not playing by Trump's rules.
I think we got to realize that the video is giving a very limited view, a distorted view even. They're picking and choosing what to show, using sources that might not be reliable, and they clearly have an agenda.
It's like trying to understand a huge painting by only looking at a tiny little corner of it. You miss the whole picture, the context.
Exactly. And in this case, they're missing the bigger picture of the war, how complicated international relations are, and all the different sides to Zelensky's leadership.
Okay, so if we step back and look at the whole thing, what do you think are the most important takeaways from all of this?
Well, first of all, we got to be careful about what we believe, right? We need to check our sources, think about different viewpoints, and watch out for those overly simplistic stories. That valuetainment video is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's so true, especially now with all the information overload and everyone in their own little bubbles online. We can't just accept everything we see. We got to be critical.
Second, we can't rely on simple labels and stereotypes, especially with something as complex as the war in Ukraine. Saying it all comes down to masculine versus feminine leadership is just not helpful, and it misses all the nuance.
It's about seeing the details, the human side of things, not just the headlines.
And lastly, I think we have to acknowledge how well Zelenskyy has led, despite all the pressure and challenges. He's shown real courage, resilience, and how committed he is to his country and his people.
He's given hope to people fighting for their freedom all over the world. And no matter what happens in the future, he's definitely made a mark.
I think that's a great way to sum it all up. It's been really interesting, talking about leadership, diplomacy, and how stories can shape our understanding of the world.
Thanks for breaking it all down. It's been a really eye-opening conversation. And to all our listeners, I hope this deep dive has made you curious and inspired you to keep looking at the world with a critical eye.